Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I hope your holiday was good. I hope everyone listening, I hope they had a great holiday. But Tim, I want to know, how was your holiday? How are you doing?
Great, thanks a lot. I'm doing well over here. Holiday was wonderful. And yeah, I'm excited to be back here releasing new episodes. And this one, Lance, is it's quite a mystery. We spoke with Gavin Whitehead of the podcast called The Art of Crime. Great podcast, great podcaster. He's very clear and very thorough. And this interview with him was based off of the episode that he produced about the Manhattan well murder. And this is the murder of Elma Sands.
And he just lays this out in such a storyteller fashion. Once he gets started, he's into it. So I want everyone who's listening to get cozy and just be ready for a great historical mystery, a true story. It takes place, I don't know if you said the year, 1799 in old Manhattan. So if you're into that, I think I'm a sucker for it. That historical mystery with a lot of elements, enough characters where you get a sense of this person's surroundings and you get a sense of what type of people existed in this particular spot in Manhattan, in this boarding house, and all of those individuals that contributed to the story. So again, like I said, get yourself a cup of hot chocolate or a glass of wine, because this is about to be a pretty fascinating tale that you're going to hear from a fascinating storyteller.
Yeah, Gavin's great. And if you want to check out his podcast, you can do so on your favorite podcatcher, but you can also go to artofcrimepodcast.com and learn about everything that Gavin is up to over there. Okay, so follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Gavin Whitehead of Art of Crime. How are you today?
I am doing just splendidly.
I love your shirt, first of all. I think I complimented your shirt the last time we were on. This shirt, for those not watching, has an assortment of pineapples and skulls.
Yes.
Which is really cool.
Yes, I picked this one out. It's one of my favorite shirts in my closet, but I also picked it out because it seemed thematically appropriate for Day of the Dead / Halloween.
I also appreciate that we're continuing the same email thread that is very focused on John Wilkes Booth, specifically me in a Halloween costume as John Wilkes Booth, and that individual who was playing Abraham Lincoln. I just want to give you an update. I managed to get this picture by reconnecting with this man, and we've since had drinks numerous times. We're good buds, and I am now the best man in his wedding coming up next spring.
Oh my goodness. So we're not only keeping the email thread alive, but we're resurrecting old friendships.
Yeah, no, that was that was a lie. I am not the best man.
Oh my gosh.
We exchanged a couple of emails, and we haven't spoken since.
You've taken me in. Well, is he already married?
I don't know.
You don't know. So there could still be hope of acting as his best man at some point.
Yeah, I'm putting it out there right now. If he's listening, I would love to be your best man.
Yeah.
Well, Gavin, I know this is now your second appearance on the Crawlspace podcast.
That's right.
But for those who haven't heard your first appearance, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I used to be a theater historian before I went into podcasting, but I've been podcasting now for a little over 2 years, and I am the host and creator of The Art of Crime, which is a history podcast about the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. Each season is structured around a different theme. So last time I came on Crawlspace, as some listeners might remember, we talked about mostly my first season, which was called The Unusual Suspects. It was all about artists who have been accused of being Jack the Ripper. My second season, it was called Assassins. So it was all about artists who had been implicated in assassination attempts or who had attempted or carried out assassinations. That's part of how we got on the topic of John Wilkes Booth when I came on the first time. I just wrapped a third season about the historic Madame Tussauds and her Chamber of Horrors. Everyone is familiar with Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. I think it's a name that we're all familiar with. A lot of people don't realize that A, there was a real life Madame Tussauds who lived, and B, that she was an institution in her lifetime. She was among the most famous showwomen in Victorian London, which is where she ultimately settled toward the end of her career. She had in her wax museum this exhibit called the Chamber of Horrors, which displayed wax likenesses of real-life notorious murderers. And these were all stories that were very much ripped from the headlines, right? So someone would commit a sensational homicide, the police would capture them, they would go to trial, and then they would be executed. And Madame Tussauds was even said to have attended homicide trials or executions to make sketches of the perpetrators to ensure the accuracy of her wax models. And so as soon as the killers were hanged, Tussauds would unveil these wax figures of them in her Chamber of Horrors so members of the public could pay to get a look at them up close. And it was a really popular aspect of her wax museum, but also a controversial one. So that season just kind of wrapped up a couple months ago. And now I've just started the fourth season. It's called Crimes of Old New York. So it's all about crimes that only could have happened in the Big Apple. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. Tim was saying that he was looking into what we're going to be talking about, and he was like, this is really fascinating. This is really cool. And I intentionally didn't look into it because I knew that it was going to be cool, and I wanted to give my own natural first reaction to it.
Yes, I will be. So I'm looking forward to your hot takes because it is a bona fide murder mystery, and the story takes some really surprising turns. So we start in the year 1799, and maybe we'll just begin by setting the scene a little bit. So nowadays, New York is a megalopolis. New York bore little resemblance to the city that we know it as today. Back in 1799, it was still a big city for the time period, but it was not a ginormous city. It was home to about 60,000 inhabitants. And just to give you a sense of how that compared to other major cities on the other side of the Atlantic, Paris had about 600,000 residents, and London was close to 1 million at the same time. So New York was definitely smaller than those other European cities. New York at this time looked more like a Midwestern market town nowadays. So there were meadows, structures tended to be 2 or 3 stories tall. Most of the population was clustered on the southwestern tip of what is now downtown Manhattan. So they lived mostly down there. There were a lot of buildings there. And then that was separated from Greenwich Village, which was a completely standalone locality at this point in time, by a bunch of meadowland. We're seeing a lot of meadows and smaller structures.
So this was 1799. This was in the very early days of America becoming its own independent nation. 60,000 people compared to almost 1 million in London. Was there ever the intent for New York to get bigger?
Definitely the port played a crucial role in all of that. Within about 10 or 20 years in the 19th century, New York would surpass Philadelphia as the most important port city. And then it's later on in the 19th century that New York really begins to mushroom because a bunch of wealthy industrialists and capitalists set up shop there, particularly on and near Wall Street. So it sort of becomes the financial and commercial capital of the country. And then it's toward the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th where we start to see skyscrapers because there's such a huge concentration of people who are moving there for business, right? But there's nowhere for them to have offices, right? They have to devise a new way of creating buildings that can accommodate so many workers. And there's actually this really great quote from a journalist who described this phenomenon back in the day. He said, the only way out was up. So they had to build larger and larger buildings. They were able to do that because of lighter steel structures, as well as the advent of the elevator in the mid-19th century, which made kind of working in giant 15 and 20 story buildings more bearable. In 1799, to answer your question, I think people understood that it was a really important port city. The port was constantly busy. They were getting Eastern perfumes, cotton, timber, all sorts of things were coming in there. I would say several decades later where it became very apparent that New York was going to become possibly the most important city in the entire country.
I love the way you paint the picture. I can almost hear the merchants, and I can smell the fishmongering happening.
So many fish to choose from.
What about the characters in this story?
Okay, so we have a pretty big cast of characters here. What's important to know is that all of the victims and the suspect in this crime lived under one roof at 208 Greenwich Street. So a boarding house stood there. The guy who presided over the boarding house was named Elias Ring. He was a Quaker who had come from upstate New York. And he had a mechanical mind. He dabbled in engineering. That was really kind of what he wanted to do with his time, I think, but he never quite met with success. So he had designed a water wheel, for example, that he wanted to kind of give to the city to help solve the water supply crisis, but that never went anywhere. Anyway, he moves to New York City, establishes himself at this boarding house. He is married, so Elias Ring is his name. He is married to Catherine Ring, also a Quaker. Catherine runs a millinery shop at 208 Greenwich Street. So at this point in history, it was pretty common for people to work where they lived. So not only are they living at 208 Greenwich Street, but they're actually operating businesses. I forgot to mention that Elias was running a dry goods store at the same address as well. There are two businesses in operation in this boarding house, one run primarily by Elias, the other by Catherine. The Rings have moved there with two relatives. The first is named Hope Sands, also a Quaker, and then the second is named Elma Sands. These two are cousins of Catherine Ring. Elma Sands, well, she's in her early 20s in 1799. Her father abandoned her family early in life and just kind of absconded to South Carolina. So she was abandoned. She and Hope Sands helped out around the millinery shop. They assisted customers, put hats on display, rang up orders, that kind of thing. They also would have assisted in the kitchen with preparing meals and tidying up in the first floor common room. So this is a boarding house, as I mentioned. So that means that there are also boarders, people who are paying to sleep and eat there. And we have to keep track of a couple of them as well. So just to recap all the family members quickly, because I know there are a lot of characters to keep track of. We have Elias Ring. He owns and runs the boarding house. Catherine Ring is his wife. Hope and Elma Sands are cousins who are also living and working at the boarding house. The first boarder we need to know about is named Levi Weeks. Levi Weeks is the brother of an extremely influential and talented architect named Ezra. And Levi is also on the way to becoming an architect. Right now, he's mostly a carpenter, so he is engaged in building whatever needs building for his brother's business. So if Ezra gets a commission for a bunch of wooden doors to go in a new house, Levi will help fashion those doors at Ezra's lumberyard. Levi also lives with a young apprentice named William, so they're roommates together at the boarding house. There is one other boarder named Richard Croucher, who is an English-born cloth merchant. I said he's a boarder, but technically he's not. He's just a roomer because he did not pay to eat meals there. He just slept there. He was known to be sort of off-putting, and he would often walk the streets in the daytime peddling linens and other kinds of textiles. Of course, all these people are living together under one roof, so friendships are going to form. Levi takes a liking to both the unmarried women who are there, so Hope and Elma Sands. They hang out together when Levi has a day off and isn't, hammering away at his brother's lumberyard. So, for example, we know they went to an entertainment venue called the Baker's Museum, which is where it was on Wall Street. That's where you could go to check out cool stuff, basically. All kinds of natural and man-made curiosities. So there were wax models of famous boxers there. At one point, they were exhibiting a live bald eagle, or you could see like gigantic lobster claws. So it was like a museum where you could go check out all this interesting stuff. And that's what they did. Levi showed a lot of attention to Elma in particular. So Elma was sickly and also prone to bouts of depression. So sometimes she would stay in bed. And when she was in bed, Levi would often look in on her, make sure she had whatever she needed, bring her meals if necessary, that kind of thing. There are these friendships and attachments that form, but there's also friction, of course, right? We don't know exactly what happened, but there was one occasion where Elma and Richard Croucher, right? So he's the English-born cloth merchant who is just a roomer. He doesn't pay for his meals. Elma and Richard Croucher quarrel in the corridor, and it's not exactly sure what's said. It is later intimated that Croucher may have put his hands where they ought not to have gone, something of that sort. And Elma chewed him out for it, told Levi about it, and then Levi exchanged very harsh words with Richard Croucher. And Richard Croucher later called Levi an impertinent puppy.
No.
I mean, that if thems aren't fighting words, I don't know what are.
It's a compliment these days.
That's right. You are one impertinent puppy. Yeah. I don't hear that enough in my life. So there's a little bit of friction between Levi and Richard Croucher. Those are all of our characters. And again, all of them live together at 208 Greenwich Street.
What's the age range?
Elma and Hope are in their early 20s. Elias and Catherine are in their mid to late 20s. Levi is also in his mid to late 20s. Most of them are in their 20s at this point. I actually am not sure how old Richard Croucher was, but I think he wasn't much older than the rest of them.
I'm picturing him to be like 35.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
That sounds about right to me.
He looks like he's 60, but he's actually 35.
Yes.
That's what I'm picturing. Okay.
Were there any specific reasons they were all in this building together?
No specific reasons. I think people just needed a place to live. You know, there was quite a bit of turnaround at this boarding house. So there were other boarders staying there who I haven't named because they aren't really important to the story. It was common for people to just kind of move in for a few months and then move out once they found somewhere else to live, or maybe they were moving to a different city. In fact, Levi had just moved in a few months before the Manhattan Well murder took place, like the summer before the Manhattan Well murder took place, and it took place in December. So he was still relatively kind of new to the boarding house when this all went down.
We have some friendships that have come out of living together. We have some friction that's reared its ugly head. Did the friction start to increase, and when?
Certainly tensions escalated, but tension was escalating all over New York. Again, we're in 1799. Late summer is basically known as yellow fever season in New York at this time. And later, once the trial for this murder happens, everyone looks back to the fever season of the preceding year and they're like, we think this all goes back to that summer. Yellow fever would visit New York and other cities pretty much annually at this point in history. Yellow fever is a truly awful disease. It's a hemorrhagic fever, so it causes you to bleed out of various orifices. The afflict would vomit what looked like coffee grounds. And of course, it came with terrible fever. So it was a really excruciating way to go, unfortunately. And apparently they would quarantine people by sending them to Staten Island at this point. So yellow fever arrives and it's really serious. Now, if you have the means to do so, there is a really easy way to avoid getting yellow fever, and that is to get the hell out of the city. So a lot of people would leave New York City, which again is really clustered on the southwestern tip of, Lower Manhattan, what we call Lower Manhattan today. And a lot of people would go to Greenwich Village, which again was separated from Manhattan by Meadowland. And from there, they might even go farther up into the country because there are fewer people around over there. So you're less likely to get infected. But also in Greenwich Village, there are certain aspects of the soil. I forgot to mention that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes. There are certain aspects of the soil in Greenwich that prevented stagnant water from pooling. So there were fewer mosquitoes around to transmit yellow fever as well. Catherine Ring, Elias's wife, decides that she wants to get out of New York, and Hope Sands accompanies her. So they both leave the boarding house as yellow fever season arrives. And they go up to the country. Elias and Catherine also have 4 children. They take them as well. But for whatever reason, Elma Sands stays behind. It's been conjectured that maybe she was sick and didn't want to undertake the journey, but it's not clear why she decides to remain at the boarding house. And Elias is there as well. Levi is also there. Richard Croucher has also stayed behind. During the yellow fever season, you asked about whether frictions were mounting or anything like that. And I said that tension was escalating, right? So tension is escalating because people are dying. Like at the height of yellow fever, 10 people are dying per day. Your neighbors are succumbing to this horrible illness. So perhaps unsurprisingly, this kind of heightened tension also comes with a heightened need for sexual release. And also inhibitions are lowered because it's a little bit like, the apocalypse has visited the city once again and everyone's dying of yellow fever. Late at night, everyone kind of hears someone sneak out of his or her room and go into that of another boarder. And then what follows is some pretty unrestrained fornication, like no effort to keep things quiet at all. It's just like, we can all hear what's going on here. And it's kind of scandalous because no one is married in this boarding house. So
You said no one is married?
Elias is married to Catherine Ring, but Catherine has left and gone to the countryside. And no one else remaining in the boarding house at this time is married to each other. Whatever sex is happening out of wedlock. Later, once the murder trial kind of captures headlines and has got everyone in town talking, everyone is convinced that this sexual relationship is at the heart of the crime.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Okay, so you're painting a pretty compelling picture right now of this boarding house. I know you said that you weren't sure why they stayed behind, but can you remind us who stayed behind? And do you have any maybe opinions on why they stayed behind? Was it because of this potential sexual relationship?
Yeah, it's tricky. So Elias would have stayed behind because he ran the boarding house, right? He was sort of the head of the household, and he also operated a dry goods store there. So someone had to be around to make sure that people were paying their rent and that the dry goods store was still in business. So I'm sure he would have stayed around just to keep everything afloat. But Elias's wife, Catherine, has left. Their children have left as well. Levi Weeks has also stayed behind. Again, I don't know with absolute certainty why he made that decision, but I assume it's because he needed to work, and his work was in New York City. So his brother, Ezra, who is this important architect I mentioned, lived and worked in New York City. And Levi needed to go into that business on a daily basis to attend to commissions. And he also was a young man, and he wasn't a man of means. So again, as I mentioned, like, you kind of had to be not necessarily wealthy, but you needed to have some money to be able to afford to leave your business for a month or two before, the yellow fever kind of died down. Levi has stayed behind. Richard Croucher, the cloth merchant, has also stayed behind, also presumably for work. And Elma Sands has stayed behind as well. And we just don't know why she would have remained. Her health might have had something to do with it, but we just aren't sure.
Because I'm assuming that it's Levi and Elma who are having the sexual encounters.
It could be. So alas, Elma Sands will eventually go missing. So yellow fever season ends in fall. Things return more or less to normal. And then December 1799 rolls around. George Washington actually dies in December 1799. Of course, he was the nation's first president, and he was a hero of the Revolutionary War, so there was a great sense of mourning and loss all over the country. Elma Sands goes missing on December 22nd. And on that date, many New Yorkers were still grieving the loss of George Washington. There were services being held across the city. A lot of pews were full of mourners on this day. But Levi was not one of those mourners because he had work to do. He went to the lumber yard early that day, gashed his knee, and then went back home to the boarding house. In something of a role reversal, Elma kind of takes care of him, plasters his knee, makes sure he has whatever he needs. Remember earlier I mentioned that Levi often sort of took care of her when she wasn't feeling well. Day goes by, and we're now at the evening. So Levi, again, always got something to do at the lumber yard. He is determined to go back over to his brother Ezra's house and finish his job, even though he has banged himself up earlier that day. He leaves that evening. So at the same time, Elias is at a Quaker meeting. Hope Sands is also at a Quaker meeting. Catherine Ring, Elias's wife, is at the boarding house, taking care of whatever needs taken care of, tidying up this and that. You know how it goes. Richard Croucher is thought to be at a cafe. Later, a friend of his says that he had come by for a birthday party. And Elma Sands is getting ready for a night out, which is unusual for her because, again, she's often kind of sickly. And there are times earlier that year where she wasn't able to go out with Levi and Hope, even though she wanted to. So Catherine helps Elma get dressed. She picks out a calico gown. So she clearly wants to look good for when she goes out. And it's December, so it's cold out, right? While Elma is dressing, she realizes that she is missing an essential article of clothing, which is a muff, which is kind of like a pillow that is meant to warm your hands in the cold. So she realizes that she doesn't have her muff, and she decides to go next door to borrow one from a neighbor named Elizabeth. She comes back with her muff. Then she's pretty much ready to go. But Catherine notices over the course of the evening that Elma keeps looking out the window as if expecting someone to show up. There's a bit of a mystery there. She doesn't know who she is expecting. So 8 o'clock rolls around. Levi comes home from Ezra's. Now, it turns out that Ezra has company. So Levi wasn't able to speak with Ezra, his brother, about a job that they needed to complete. So his plan is to go back over to Ezra's at about 8:30. And Elma is planning to go out. At this point, Elias has come home, but Hope has not yet returned. They were both at the Quaker meeting. So eventually, the next really important account comes from Catherine Ring. This is a few minutes later, somewhere in the kind of 8:30 range. She's downstairs. I don't really know what she was doing at the time, but her ears prick up because she hears someone whispering outside near the front door of the boarding house. And maybe she's a little nosy, or maybe she's just like, why are people whispering? What is that all about? Just curiosity. But her ears prick up, she holds her breath, and she goes to a door and listens. And she's like, people are definitely whispering out there. And she hears footsteps going up and down the stairs. And then finally she hears the front door open and close. She thinks those footsteps might belong to Levi, but she can't say for certain. It's clear that someone has left the boarding house, and she doesn't really know why, but a shudder passes over her, and she's kind of gripped by anxiety for the rest of the night. So at 10 p.m. on December 22nd, Levi comes home. He asks after both Hope and Elma. Neither have come back. So Hope is still at that Quaker meeting, and Elma's whereabouts are just unknown. And Levi goes up and hits the hay. That's the end of the day for him. So that's how December 22nd ends. So the next morning, December 23rd, everyone goes down to the breakfast table, and Hope is there. So clearly she came home last night, but Elma has not returned. She's not at the table. That definitely raises questions for some of them, but Elma has missed breakfast before. Sometimes she just doesn't feel well and she stays in bed. So nobody thinks much of it at this point. But when Levi comes home for lunch that same day, Elma still has not emerged from her bedroom. And so this is when he grows concerned, and he asks Catherine Ring, have you seen Elma? Where is Elma? She's like, I haven't seen her. I think she's just up in her room. So Levi goes up to Elma's room and looks in on her, and it's empty. And he yells down, hey, she's not in here. So at this point, clearly Elma had not come home last night. This is when it becomes apparent. So Catherine starts thinking, okay, well, where could she have gone? Maybe she stayed at another boarding house nearby. She writes a letter to this guy named Henry who ran a boarding house. She's thinking maybe the weather turned really nasty in the night and Elma couldn't make it home. So she popped over to this other boarding house for shelter for the night. Hey, Henry, did you see Elma last night? He writes back, no one saw her here. And then also that day, I remember Elma went next door to borrow a muff. That neighbor, Elizabeth, comes over and says Elma never came back to return the muff. At this point, the questions are just multiplying. Where is Elma and what happened to her?
For the first time ever, I wrote a note that said, was the muff returned? So this is going to be highlighted in my notebook, and you just answered the question because I knew you wouldn't have brought up this muff unless it was going to come in later on. So the muff is still missing, and Elma's still missing. Is anyone acting suspicious at this point?
Unlike the first day of the vanishing, no one is acting suspicious yet. But that changes very quickly. It's maybe a day or two after Elma's initial disappearance that Catherine Ring goes up to Levi, corners him in some room at the boarding house, and says, Levi, this needs to stop. This has gotten too serious. And listen, I know what you were planning to do with Elma. And at this point, Catherine reveals to Levi what Elma had told her the night of her disappearance. So the night of Elma's vanishing, she apparently came and told Catherine that she and Levi were planning to elope that very night. They're going to run away and marry. And perhaps, that's why she had dressed up for the occasion. Levi was out at Ezra's. Maybe that's why Elma was constantly looking out the window as if expecting Levi to come back at any minute. And Levi freaks out, understandably, because at this point it looks like Elma is gone and this looks very bad for him. Anyone can see that. Levi panics and he goes to Hope Sands. So remember, Hope is Elma's sister, and Hope is also a friend of Levi. And he's like, will you please go with me to the city officials and basically swear before them that I had not shown any particular affection for Elma. Like, this was a completely platonic relationship. There was nothing happening between us. And Hope straight up refuses. She's like, I'm not doing that because I know that's untrue. Because she had seen this kind kind of what she later called a kind of romantic relationship forming between them over the course of the summer. And according to Hope, there was also an instance where they were all kind of hanging out in Elma's room, and it was kind of made clear to her, Hope, that she needed to make herself scarce so that Levi and Elma could be together. And Hope took the hint and left the room. And she kind of, she was a Quaker, but she knew enough about the world to know what was going on as soon as she left. So she had sensed this kind of attachment intensifying between Levi and Elma over the course of the summer. And on top of that, you might remember I mentioned Levi had a roommate, his young apprentice named William. William also had an eyebrow-raising story to tell about Levi's behavior. So one night, William was in bed, and Levi came home and, got ready for bed himself. And Levi clearly thought William was already fast asleep, but he wasn't. He was just lying there awake. After waiting a few minutes, Levi got out of bed just in his shirt, according to William, and left. This was back in the yellow fever season, right? When these kind of mysterious midnight trysts were all taking place.
He wasn't wearing pants?
I actually am not entirely sure what it means. I've always pictured it as like a nightgown, but he wasn't fully dressed is the point.
Okay.
So it's clear that he wasn't like getting ready to go out. He was going somewhere in the house, and he didn't return until morning, which is another crucial distinction.
My eyebrows did raise. I don't know if you saw that.
I clocked it. Everyone's eyebrows were doing the same. Yeah, things were really not looking good for Levi at this point. But Elma also has not materialized, so nobody knows where she is. On December 30th, Elias decides to take action because earlier on I mentioned that Elma was kind of prone to melancholia, and in fact, she had kind of made some comments about how she wanted to end her own life, perhaps by overdosing on laudanum. They had kind of seen these as jokes, but, now that she had disappeared, they started to take them much more seriously, and they began to worry that maybe she had committed suicide. So on December 30th, Elias has part of the Hudson River dredged to see if maybe she drowned herself. Nothing turns up. 2 more days elapse before a meaningful clue surfaces.
Before we get to that, tell anybody who doesn't know what laudanum is.
It was a kind of medicine that was used. It was often prescribed to people who were sick, and it could put you to sleep. If you took it in large quantities, it could prove lethal.
Okay. And then you said that they dredged the river.
Uh-huh.
What is the process to do that back then?
I don't know for sure, but I believe they just ran kind of like a net along the bottom of the river so that it would catch anything that had maybe laying there. So they're hoping to come up with her body.
Yeah, it must have been something simple like that. I just always like to get my head in that space because
totally.
All of our heads are in like modern day thinking. All right, so you mentioned the first meaningful clue.
Yes. So actually the first meaningful clue is discovered a few days earlier on December 24th. But it's not recognized as a meaningful clue right away. I mentioned that there is meadowland that separates Manhattan from Greenwich Village. Part of that is called Lispenard's Meadow. And in Lispenard's Meadow is the so-called Manhattan Well. It's a well that was built by the Manhattan Company as part of a process of trying to solve a really tenacious problem for New York, which was like the water supply. How do we get more water to people? This well was built. It was about 6 feet tall. It was brick. Ultimately, it was deemed unsuitable. So the company just never used it. They had it boarded up. So there's a family that lives on the verge of Lispenard's Meadow where a lot of people like to go hunting and sledding in the wintertime, and children would play around there all the time. This little boy is playing on Christmas Eve, and he notices that one of the boards that has covered up the Manhattan Well has been moved. So he goes over to investigate and looks into the water and sees something floating at the top. Dips his hand in, picks it up, and what is it but a woman's muff? So he's like, oh, this is kind of a cool find. And he goes home and gives it to his mom as a Christmas present. So several days pass, and it becomes evident that the Ring Clan and other New Yorkers are looking for this woman who went missing on December 22nd. And it's known that she had borrowed a muff the night of her disappearance. And like, oh my God, what if this is the muff in question? Elias Ring is made aware of this discovery in the Manhattan Well. He marches over there with several neighbors, and they go and they look down into the well. They see nothing at first. They get a pole, they stick it down in there, they move it around, and they feel an unmoving lump down at the very bottom of the well. There is something down there, but the water is so dark they can't make anything out. So eventually they're able to fashion kind of a crude net, and they lower it down and they hoist it up, and lo and behold, they see the calico gown that Elma had picked out for herself on the night of her vanishing, and finally there she is. Her face is there. It's Elma. Elias Ring has discovered her at long last. Immediately, grief takes hold of the entire city. An inquest is held, and homicide is cited as the cause of death. So it's believed that she was murdered and then thrown into the Manhattan well. New York is just consumed with both grief and rage over this because she was such a young woman and it was such a senseless murder. And actually the Rings unintentionally kind of feed into all of these negative emotions because they decide to display the body in public, and they lay Elma's body out literally on the street for 2 full days because there's such intense public interest in what happened to her, and people want to pay their last respects to her. Thousands of people come to see Elma Sands' body out in the street. You could imagine it'd be such a visceral experience, right? So people are just getting more and more worked up. And by now, we already have a pretty good suspect because word has gotten around that Levi Weeks was having this secret relationship with Elma. So a police officer goes to the lumberyard, taps Levi on the shoulder. Levi wheels around. At this point, he does not know that Elma Sands' body has been discovered. This is happening like right after the discovery, right? And Levi spins around, sees the police officer, sees the expression on the officer's face. He just intuits that the police officer has come there, right, to arrest him for something related to Elma Sands' disappearance. Levi begins by saying, "It's not okay for you to come in here with accusations." Then he stops mid-sentence. His face falls, and then he goes, "So was it in the Manhattan well where she was found?" The police officer had not made any mention of the Manhattan well up to this point. So again, this really looks bad for Levi because only the killer could have known where she would be discovered, right? The police officer takes Levi straight to the body, which has been laid out next to the well at this point. It's later moved when the Rings place it on public display. The police officer is like, "Do you know that woman who lies there a corpse?" Levi eventually says yes, and he's thrown in jail.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Leaving a body out like that, is that something that was typical back then? And was the purpose just strictly for motivating people to try to find justice here?
It absolutely was not typical. And that's part of what really stands out about this case. What was typical was for Quakers to lay out bodies for family members to come and visit them. But they would do that indoors in a private setting, right? It was almost unheard of for someone to lay a body out literally on the street for 2 days. And it was just to give the public a chance to say goodbye to this woman and to kind of mourn collectively and publicly the loss of life and just to express their outrage about this senseless crime. So yeah, it was really just about that. And of course, as you mentioned, I think this would intensify a desire for justice.
Gotcha. So Levi's put in the slammer.
He is put in the slammer.
And is there a subsequent trial?
Oh, there's a trial. And it is the trial of the century. At this point, we're in like the first 3 months of 1800, and we've already got the trial of the century. So part of why it's a trial of the century, and part of why people are still fascinated by this case today, you might remember Levi worked for his brother Ezra, who was very well connected, very influential, and also quite wealthy. So Ezra had access to the best legal talent New York had to offer. And he hires 3 attorneys to represent Levi in court. 2 of those attorneys are, get this, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So, of course, we know that Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and they were longtime political rivals. However, there was a limited pool of attorneys in New York at this time, and they were both practicing law. So it was sort of inevitable that they would end up representing the same client in court every now and again. And that's what happened in the case of Levi Weeks. And when Burr and Hamilton worked together, they were actually great collaborators. 2 of the attorneys are Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. The third is this guy named Brockholst Livingston, who goes on to serve as a Supreme Court justice. So Levi's legal team is stacked, like as stacked as it can be. Several months pass as attorneys on both sides are gathering evidence, and the trial commences on March 31st.
Take us to the trial.
Okay, well, let's go through the trial. We'll start with the prosecution. The prosecutor is named Cadwallader Colden. He wants to prove that Levi had promised to elope with Elma, but did not actually want to go through with it. He murdered her and then threw her body into the Manhattan well. That's the case that he is trying to make. He calls for the testimony of several people who lived at 208 Greenwich. They sort of say a lot of the things that I've already said already. Most of what we know about this comes from the courtroom testimony. But there's one person who kind of sticks out early on, and this is Elias Ring. So he takes the stand and he talks about going into Elma's bedroom at one time and finding the sheets in disarray. And he's like, oh, Elias strongly intimates that that means that Elma had just been having sex in the bed or something. And Alexander Hamilton kind of makes fun of him for that. He never really presses Elias on any of that subject matter. Instead, he raises this question that confounds everyone in attendance. And the courtroom is packed because everyone is talking about this case. And so Alexander Hamilton, out of nowhere, asks Elias, so Elma's bed was on the second story of the boarding house, and it was right next door to another home, which belonged to a blacksmith named Joseph Watkins. And Alexander Hamilton goes, so how thick is the partition between Elma's room and Joseph Watkins' house? And Elias is like, well, I mean, it's like a standard partition. I don't know what you really want me to say here. And Alexander Hamilton's like, could you hear the noise of children playing through that partition? And Elias is like, no, I don't think so. I can't recall. And then Alexander Hamilton says, well, is Joseph Watkins a good neighbor and an honest man? And Elias answers yes. And Hamilton leaves it at that. There's kind of this air of confusion, like, why is this relevant to anything? But anyone who knew Hamilton as a lawyer knew that he was a smooth operator, and many might have sensed that he was laying a trap, which in fact he was, and we will hear about that in due course. So at this point, the prosecutor has tried to show that there was this burgeoning romance between Levi and Elma. He then argues that Levi went to Ezra's lumberyard with Elma, took a sleigh from there, rode from Ezra's house to the Manhattan well, strangled Elma, and then otherwise kind of belabored her, and then threw the body into the well, returned the sleigh to Ezra's house, and then went back home to the boarding house at 208 Greenwich Street at 10 o'clock. And he calls various witnesses to the stand to support this. There's another witness who also claims to have heard screams coming from near the Manhattan well. Then I have Elma's disappearance. The important point is that Levi is said to have gone with Elma to Ezra's property, then proceeded from there to the Manhattan well on a sleigh, committed the murder, then gone back to Ezra's, then back to the boarding house. So that's the prosecution's case. And there is medical testimony. There's one doctor who testifies to having observed Elma's body and seen spots around her collarbone that point toward physical violence. So he maintains that she clearly suffered physical violence, and that is what led to her death.
So strangulation?
Strangulation is a possibility. She had different defensive wounds. It looks like the medical experts claim that there was clear signs of some kind of struggle. There's scratch marks. Strangulation was very much a possibility.
Wow. And what was the defense like?
Okay, so the defense is where things get real. Aaron Burr actually makes the opening remarks. And he gets up, and he is just as talented a public speaker as you can find, right? And he just owns this opening remark so hard. He's like, listen, public sentiment has been inflamed against my client. You have people exposing bodies in the street for 2 days. This is just going to make people furious and cry out for justice, which is, of course, exactly what happened. And everyone has leapt to conclusions about the guilt of Levi Weeks. And we're going to prove, first of all, that Levi did not commit this murder. And then second of all, we're going to show you that there is a more suspicious individual seated in this very courtroom. So that's how Aaron Burr starts. Let's check in. Who are your suspects? If Levi Weeks did not commit this murder, then who did?
Richard Croucher.
He's the English-born cloth merchant.
Boom. Throw the book at him. The altercation in the hallways got me thinking that's a weird thing to do. Especially if he did touch her inappropriately. That's a huge red flag.
Is that it? So we'll stay with Richard Croucher. Okay, it's a good guess. All right, so let's proceed. So first, they need to kind of take apart this idea that Levi and Elma were having a relationship with each other. The defense calls to the stand Joseph Watkins. So remember, he's the blacksmith who lives right next door to Elma's bedroom. Earlier on in the proceedings, Alexander Hamilton had kind of grilled Elias Ring about the wall separating their rooms. And so it becomes clear in Watkins' testimony that he, like all the other residents at 208 Greenwich Street, heard this late night lovemaking during the yellow fever season. He could hear it through the wall, loud and clear. But unlike the other residents at 208 Greenwich, he knew the identity of both people involved because that's how clearly he could hear their voices. One of those people was indeed Elma, but the other one was most assuredly not Levi. It was actually Elias Ring, the married man and Quaker who presided over the boarding house. And he had a super distinctive voice, and Joseph Watkins was like, that is Elias Ring. He's like pretty much privy to this infidelity that is going on right next door to him. And of course, this is kind of earth-shaking, right? Because everyone had assumed that Levi was the one going upstairs to spend the night with Elma, but that's not what was going on at all. So again, that's a major blow to the prosecution. Several other major blows are as follows. Okay, nobody ever saw Levi and Elma leave the boarding house together. And even though several witnesses were called by the prosecution, none of them actually saw Levi and Elma together outside on the street. And then here is the part where it gets really bad for the prosecution. Levi actually had a pretty tight alibi for the entire evening, which is very much downplayed. So he goes back to 208 Greenwich. He shows up at 208 Greenwich Street at 8 o'clock p.m. He's like, okay, I have to go back over to Ezra's house later tonight because he has company and I need to talk to him, but his friends aren't going to be gone until like 8:30. So he's at 208 Greenwich at 8 o'clock. He waits there until about 8:30. He goes over to Ezra's. And then Ezra Weeks testifies and is like, Levi came over to my house and Elma was not with him. And he stayed at my house until 10 p.m. And then Levi was placed back at the boarding house at about 10 p.m. It was simply impossible for him to have gone to Ezra's, gotten this sleigh out of the lumberyard. There was just no time for him to do that. And he was known to have returned to the boarding house that night. And then, God, the part that is really cringe, and it's so hard to take seriously nowadays because so much of us like watch police procedurals and we think we know a thing or two about like forensic science. But basically, the most compelling medical expert for the prosecution was like, oh my God, I saw these spots on Elma's collarbone, and those are clear signs of strangulation, right? So that guy actually examined Elma's body as it was lying out in the street. So at that point, the body had been in a well, it's submerged in water for almost 2 weeks. They had actually performed surgery on the body after the death to see if she was pregnant. And then beyond that, her body had been lying out in the elements to decompose for 2 days. And that's when he observed the body. And another medical expert for the defense was like, okay, if a body has been left literally in water and then out in the streets and then opened up as part of surgery, like it's going to look banged up. Decomposition will have set in. This is not proof at all that she was murdered. And in fact, we cannot rule out the possibility that she committed suicide. So suicide is still on the table as a possible explanation. So at this point, there's no reason really to assume that Levi committed this crime. Suicide might have been the possibility, but the defense also wants to leave open the possibility that another culprit lay behind this crime. And that is Richard Croucher. Correct. Got it. 100%. Remember, Joseph Watkins is the blacksmith who overheard who was kind of aware of Elias's adultery, right? He told Richard Croucher about that. And he was the only resident at 208 Greenwich Street who knew about it. And the theory goes that Richard Croucher had hated Levi because of this harsh exchange in the corridor and just wanted to frame him for Elma's murder. So he blackmailed Elias and Catherine Ring. So imagine if it came out that Elias, this Quaker, had been having an affair. I mean, his entire name would be ruined, the house would be ruined, etc., etc. Richard Croucher is implied to have blackmailed them, who in turn pointed the finger at Levi and kind of trumped up this story about, you know, this illicit or this clandestine affair between Levi and Elma. Basically, that kind of convinced the public that Levi was guilty before he could even go to trial. And so the argument is that Croucher did this kind of as a way of exacting revenge because of the grudge that he bore Levi. And that's basically the defense's case. So after that, the judge gives some of the most remarkable instructions to the jury I've ever heard. But he basically says at one point, there is no evidence to suggest that Levi Weeks committed this murder. And he dismisses the jury to reach their verdict. They return within 5 to 10 minutes, and they say not guilty. So Levi goes free, everyone cheers, and when Levi showed up to the court on the first day of the trial, people were literally outside chanting, "Crucify him." So like they were calling for his blood because they were convinced of his guilt. And then as soon as the not guilty verdict comes down, everyone's like, "Oh, thank goodness he got away." Thank goodness he was acquitted. He clearly wasn't guilty of this crime.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I'm so glad I didn't look into this. You're so thorough, and the storytelling is so good. Like, that was probably, like, one of the best I've heard in a long time.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the twists and turns are just built into the narrative, though. I mean,
yeah.
When I first found out that Elias was the one having the affair, I think I actually gasped. I might have actually gasped a little bit.
So in preparation for this conversation, I was listening to your episode. I did not finish it by the time this began, though. So I did not know for sure. I did not know. That was basically a guess, an informed guess, because I listened to most of it.
Yes. I'll add that other researchers who have looked at this case have pointed the finger at him as well. He did have a history as a criminal, and in fact, he was found guilty of raping a teenage girl at 208 Greenwich Street the same year as this trial, and he was convicted in that case. He eventually got out of prison, went down to Virginia, appears to have gotten thrown back in jail, and then went back to England, where he's said to have been executed for some crime, although it's not really a well-substantiated claim. But anyway, the case is still unsolved technically, but Richard Croucher is a pretty good suspect as far as suspects go.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, really well done taking us through that story, Gavin, and an amazing work on your show, The Art of Crime. What is coming up next on your season of Crimes of Old New York?
It's all about the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts, right? I should say that I've left the kind of artistic connection out of this story, but there was actually a race. Public interest in this trial was so high that they wanted a full transcript for it. And there was a race to the printing press to see who could produce the first and most detailed account of the trial of Levi Weeks. And multiple publishers got involved, and it really came down to who had mastered the art of stenography. Anyway, the trial of Levi Weeks, it became the first fully recorded homicide trial in U.S. history because people were trying to make these accurate transcriptions of everything that was said in the courtroom. I talk about that at greater length in the episode. What's coming up? I have some really cool episodes coming up. There's going to be one about a bank robber named George L. Leslie. He was known as the king of bank robbers. He was active in the 1860s and 70s. Part of why he was so good at robbing banks, it was said, was that he had studied architecture and was able to draw on his architectural training to mastermind these incredibly intricate heists. So he would visit banks in advance, and he had a photographic memory. So he would commit the floor plan to memory and then go home and draw blueprints because, of course, he had done that plenty of times as an architect. And then, he would give these blueprints to members of his gang, and they would build replicas of the bank in abandoned warehouses around New York, and then have members of his gang rehearse every moment of the heist in advance. So it was like this kind of Super Bowl halftime performance. It was so choreographed. So George Leslie is one of the guys we're going to talk about. We have another one, which is about a murder that took place at Madison Square Garden in the first decade of the 20th century. So the architect who designed Madison Square Garden was named Stanford White, and he got involved in a love triangle with a Broadway showgirl named Evelyn Nesbit, and then this trust fund ne'er-do-well Harry Thaw. And Stanford White, the architect of Madison Square Garden, was actually shot dead at Madison Square Garden in the middle of a performance, and it became another cause celeb. It was actually called the trial of the century too. It was so sensational, partly because it really threw a light on just how widespread sexual exploitation was in New York, but specifically within the entertainment industry. So those are a couple of the cases that we'll look at.
Well, hey, please come back on and discuss those when you're ready to. It's always a delight to have you on the show.
It was a delight to come back.